Timor relatively often. I wish Amnesty International could go there relatively often, but they can't.
Why not?
Because they are seen by the Indonesian government as so biased that they won't be allowed in. I disagree with that. I disagree with that, and as I said in my statement, the United States believes that more access and openness, not less, should be the goal. But we do go there. We talk to others who go there. We talk to those who are there. We talk to all factions. We travel around. We try to get the best sense we can of what's taking place, and then we report it and we act on it. And
training. Since the invasion of Timor, the U.S. has trained more than 2,600 Indonesian officers through IMET. One of the more notable examples of U.S. training is General Benny Murdani, now the Indonesian defense minister, long very close to the U.S., a fluent English speaker, and the man who personally planned the invasion of East Timor, who personally saw to the removal of the previous Timorese archbishop, and who came into Timor 2 years ago, gathered the local Timorese elite, and gave a speech in which he told them, don't even think about independence. If you even try to think about it, we will crush you. This is General Murdani. And again, I think it's truly insulting to the Indonesians for the U.S. to be suggesting, after all these years, after all those millions and millions of dollars worth of weapons and helicopters and planes, after all those years of constant political ratification and re-ratification, that in these training sessions, the U.S. is somehow saying to the Indonesians, no, no, don't do what you've done up to this moment, do something else. And the Indonesians go out and disobey that U.S. training, and then the U.S. responds to that by rewarding them with still more. I mean, it's insulting both to the Indonesians and to the intelligence of the listener. Clearly, the U.S. and the Indonesian military are pursuing the same policy in East Timor.
Yes, this gentleman.
Thank you. First, I'd like to thank Mr. Dinger for so eloquently reading the Assistant Secretary of State Kenneth Quinn's testimony before Congress last February. And I think that report does a very dutiful job of echoing the Indonesian's National Investigation Commission's report issued last December. And I think it has a number of very serious holes practically on every point, and I think I would ask somebody else to address those. Just one point on that before I ask my question.
No, do ask your question. We're really pressing late, so please get to it.
Okay, I'll skip the obvious factual error. The question I would like to ask is a question about witnesses, about testimony, about credibility of testimony. All indications, including the two tourist Australian journalists who were deported just last week, Dennis Schultz last week, and Peter Goodman, for example, this is all well after the massacre, have testified saying things like, Dili is now a city under siege. There are 10,000 troops stationed there, probably 40 in every village. This is now. Professor Anderson has alluded to Theo Chaffe's very obvious statements that the oppression and repression in East Timor have gotten quite obviously worse, and Indonesia is making no secret about that whatsoever. Their statement is a clear reversal, and there's no denying that it's a clear reversal of their previous attempt at opening up the territory. They've now gone back to a policy of divide and conquer. They've forced people to go into the hills.
Sir, you must ask your question, please.
I'm sorry. The question is, how does the U.S. State Department verify, in the face of all of this testimony, that's coming out of East Timor, what is actually happening there? Amos Wako, the UN Special Reporter on Torture, for example, for one example, was preceded by troops. Theo Schaffe went 2 miles ahead of him as he was walking along to make sure that there was no sign of dissent. He even interrupted a football match, for example, thinking that it was a political presentation. So how does, in this kind of conditions, how does the State Department intend, and how can it possibly verify that there are not continuing human rights abuses even now in East Timor? And that's my question.
The State Department does not deny that there have been human rights abuses in East Timor.
Continuing, even now.
And there probably are human rights abuses that have continued since. They have not been on the scale, anything like the scale of what happened on November 12th, nor had there been in recent years prior to November 12th. That was an aberration from the trend that had been taking place for the past 2 years. How do we go about trying to figure out what's happening in East Timor? First, we visit there. We've had 5 visits there since November 12th. If our budget were larger, we'd visit there more often. But we visit there as often as we can. We've had, I think it's 10 visits in the last 2 years. That's not full-time, but that's something. There are other embassies in Jakarta that visit there, too. We talk with them. We compare notes. There are Westerners, there are Indonesians in Dili, in other parts of East Timor, with whom we communicate, and we talk to them about what's happening. There are East Timorese, a number of them, with whom we communicate. When we visit, we wander the streets and talk to people.
Do you feel that you're free to wander the streets, wherever you'd like to go?
American State Department, they can wander anywhere they like. The point is that, no East Timorese with one gray cell would ever talk to anyone from the State Department, because the next thing that will happen is they'll end up in the torture chamber.
And let me comment on the idea.
That's not accurate.
I can say some personal experience about that if you're interested.
Well, just to comment on that, Governor Carrascolau and Bishop Bello both told us that that is precisely the case, and we interviewed great numbers of people who had exactly the experience, who, because they spoke to foreigners or tried to pass out information about the killings and the tortures, they were arrested. In fact, right now, one of the people who was just put on trial in Dili was charged with the crime of trying to send out to the outside world a transcript of a public interview that was given by the governor. This was considered to be subversion, leaking of classified information, and they were arrested and put on trial by the Indonesian authorities. The idea, this is a very important point, the idea that the massacre was an aberration from a positive trend is pure fantasy. We spoke to Bishop Bello before the massacre, well before the massacre. He compared the situation at that time to 1983, which, if you know the history of Timor, was a particularly grim period with several major massacres. This was when the army was convening people throughout the countryside, telling them if you speak to the Portuguese UN delegation, you will be killed and your families will be killed to the 7th generation. And these threats were being backed up with increased assassinations and disappearances and tortures and so on. It should also be pointed out that the military people who are now facing internal military trials, although details of what they're being charged with has not been released, Amnesty testified to the Senate that the report from the Military Honor Commission indicates that it seems that the thing these soldiers are being charged with for November 12th is for being too lenient, for allowing the demonstration to take place in the first place. And the sackings of the intelligence people that have happened since the massacre have been publicly announced as being in punishment for them allowing the demonstration to take place. And let me just quote briefly from an interview from the current commander, General Sayafi, given to Compass, the Indonesian publication, on March 17. The interviewer asks, "So what attitude will the armed forces take?" And the general says, "I'll say to my troops, win over the people. The people are obliged to follow. If not," and this is what the soldiers are to say to the people, "please flee to the bush. If they go to the bush, they then become GPK, the security disruptor gangs, and the policy on GPK is that you can shoot them on sight." He said, "I'm only restoring Aubrey armed forces. I'm only restoring Aubrey standards. Demonstrations don't exist according to Indonesian law, and neither, I might add, do those people who engage in them."
Mr. Nairn, is that?
Ask.
Sorry, I'm sorry. Did you want to say something, Mr. Dinger?
I had one short question for Mr. Nairn. I'm wondering if that's the same article in Kopassus in which General Shafe gave his plans for the Indonesian military's role in East Timor in the future, in which he stated that it's his every intention to, one, reduce the number of troops